Okay, everyone, good afternoon. Let's get this going. I see the clock says it's exactly the right time.
Board to give up.
So Bob wants to speak first?
Yes,
Okay.
and he's going to introduce you.
All right. We're going to let Robert take over for a second.
Just a second. Thank you all for coming. The talks are put on by the Victor Historic Advisory Committee, and we work with Babette Huber. And before we get started, I would just like to recognize one of our members who just retired. And I can't think of very many people that have done more for the community of Victor and the town, whether it's the church or the history of the town or the businesses of the town or festivals that we've put on, than Sue Stelling. And Sue, thank you so much for your service. We just wanted to present you. And this is the last presentation we'll be doing in the spring. We'll start up again in the fall. We'll continue to do the presentations on Sunday afternoon. If you put your name and email address on the sign-up sheet as you come in, we will add you to the sign-up to our mailing list. So you get a reminder whenever we do a talk like this, which should be helpful. With that, I'd just like to introduce Kathryn White, who's the director of the Valentown, the Victor Historical Society. Again, a real treasure for the town of Victor to have Valentown and to have the work continue. And so thankful to Kathryn for all she's done to keep it going. And then also presenting today is Lynn Perry, who's the webmaster and historian. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here. Okay.
I think it's amazing that a place can keep telling you story. Story is so important for history, but it's important for everybody, even the stories that happened yesterday. But with this place, it never stops. And I think that you'll all enjoy, you've had other aspects of what we've all known and learned about over the years, but this new angle that we've discovered, probably because of COVID, I think you're all going to enjoy. And it's become to us one of the integral parts of why Valentown is there. And it has to do with the farming community, how they organized themselves when they weren't organized, and how they interacted and kept all in touch with everybody and integrated. Today it's very easy, but you have to realize in those days you had to go visit somebody or you had to have a meeting. And I think you're going to like the first half is a very kindly donated mini movie. We don't have popcorn. But you will enjoy what Don Valone has done for us. He was so intrigued by the place that he actually produced this and gave it to us. And the second half is going to be about the new aspects of Valentown and the Victor Grange that resided there for 33 years. So enjoy. I hope you like this. I'm pressing.
Echoes from a town that never existed. In northwest Ontario County, just outside of Rochester, New York, an unusual building stands in much the same appearance as it looked when it first was built nearly a century and a half ago. In the rolling hills of land once populated only by the Seneca Indians,
A homestead was built by Ichabod Town.
in a section of land that had been part of the Phelps and Gorham Purchase of 1788, following the American Revolutionary War. A nearby center of business would eventually become incorporated as the town of Victor, New York, in 1813, 4 years after town purchased his land. About 5 miles northwest of town is a village called Fishers. If you lived in the area during the early 19th century, you would need to travel by horse and buggy to one of those centers to do business and purchase supplies. Food, tools and farm equipment, shoes and clothing for your family, medicines, and general household items. Town's daughter married a man named Samuel Valentown, and they built a farm together on part of 140 acres that his father-in-law Ichabod Town had purchased in 1809. During the War of 1812, troops had camped on the acreage. The family was very patriotic.
In 1861, they painted several structures on the farm red, white, and blue to bolster patriotism in support of the local troops during the Civil War.
His patriotic tribute became the focal point of a community gathering every 4th of July, where the townspeople would celebrate with an annual community picnic. Valentine's farmland sat at the crossroads of historic Indian trails, amongst old burial grounds and sacred Indian sites. Here, a cluster of other farms soon created the need for nearby essentials, such as a schoolhouse and blacksmith, to help reduce the number of long buggy rides into town for supplies. Valentine had 2 sons, Elinson and Levi. With obvious limitations in travel by horse and buggy, railroads were essential for the transport of goods, especially coal, which was used for heating during long, cold winters. Late in the 1870s, Valentine received unexpected visitors to his farm from out of town. They turned out to be surveyors from the Pittsburgh, Shawmut, and Northern Railroad Company. Located out of Pennsylvania, they brought valuable coal north to areas of western New York, such as Buffalo. The railroad wanted to expand their operation to Pulteneyville to service Rochester and its eastern suburbs, and they were selecting land on which to build their rails and new station. Valentine's farmland was a perfect location along the route, and they were eager to solicit interest from Valentine. Samuel Valentine's 2 sons saw the opportunity of a lifetime to carry out their grandfather's legacy of building up a prosperous town on the land that their grandfather had purchased 70 years earlier. With only a handshake and a dream as collateral, Levi Valentine began to build a 4-story wooden structure at the crossroads that would become a focal point of the new town center. It would have the capacity to address almost every need of the residents and employees of the new rail station that would be built on Valentine's property. The building would be a grand hall with space for merchants of every kind, all under one roof. Multiple stores shared frontage like a strip mall, yet were also connected to common indoor spaces. Shoppers could even park their horse and buggy indoors, where a stable could be entered from the ground floor at the rear of the building. The busy town that would thrive around the new business center would be named by Levi Valentine to honor both of his parents' family names, Valentine and Town, and would be called Valentown. The building was named Valentown Hall and would open to the public less than 2 years later when the building was complete. It had a general store, a butcher, a bakery, a post office, a cobbler, a blacksmith, a telegraph office, essential for a busy railroad town, a barber shop, a music school, and more. The idea was unique and the forerunner to the modern mall, one of which would ironically be built nearly a century later, practically across the street from Valentine's building. Valentown was a grand community center and even had a ballroom dance hall on the top story, with 18-foot high ceilings, chandeliers, and a small stage for community events and concerts. There were schools for music, art, and acting. The future silent film star Mary Pickford even studied there as a young girl. The Victor Military Band often played in the hall, and it thrived as a meeting place, a community, and cultural center. At least for a short time, while the town waited for the railroad extension to be built. They waited through the 1880s and 90s, but the railroad never came. The railway company had gone bankrupt before it reached Valentown. Interest in the business center declined when the community realized that the railroad was never coming. Valentown was never able to fully recoup his investment without the railroad and was forced to sell the property. Although there is a road named after the town, Valentown never became incorporated as a real town and never appeared on a map. Businesses left the Hall and the crossroads of Valentown and moved back to the original business districts of Fishers, Scudderville, now East Victor, and Victor Center, which became the center of modern industry in the area. The Hall did continue to serve as a community center and provided some specialty shops and services until at least 1910. Then, during World War I, it was used as a drill hall for local soldiers and a center for the Red Cross. Valentown basically became a ghost town. The school and businesses moved to more modern structures as electricity and automobiles arrived in the rural community. After the war years, Valentown Hall fell into disuse and disrepair and was scheduled to be torn down in 1940. There was seemingly no life left for an old wooden structure supported only by timber beams in a time when concrete and steel structures had become the norm. But a local historian named J. Sheldon Fisher was familiar with the promise and history that the structure held and saved it from demolition by purchasing Valentown Hall and lovingly restoring it as a museum to showcase its original glory days when townsfolk excitedly waited for the railroad to come. Fisher's family were founding members of the Hamlet of Fishers, and the family homestead was just down the road from Valentown Hall. After purchasing the hall and restoring the upstairs ballroom, he hired a band and held dances there again during World War II, bringing new life to the historic structure. Fisher even lived in the structure for a while during his restoration of the hall. He filled rooms with local antiques and studied the local history, especially the Native American history of the area, and wrote books on local folklore. He was even adopted by the Seneca Nation in 1964 for his work in the preservation of their heritage. He created the Ganondagan State Historic Site in the former Seneca Indian Village in Victor. Fisher also helped found the Victor Historical Society during his effort to preserve the Valentown site. However, a long-term debt on the property nearly threatened to force the Historical Society to sell the property to developers who were eager to tear down the historic structure and build a new development. Generous gifts from the community helped save the site. Fisher died in 2002, but his museum is still operated by the Historical Society, relying on volunteers and donations to keep the site safely away from the clutches of land developers.
At precisely the time in history that Valentown had built the hall, the Grange movement was picking up momentum. Rural America was a thriving farmland. Farmers needed not only a place to sell their harvest, but also meeting places to discuss the issues that were most important to them, such as the cost of shipping their goods to distant towns and cities. Much of the transportation beyond a few miles was done by train, which was the driving incentive to build Valentown Hall to begin with. With the nearest train station to Valentown still miles away, local farmers were as much in need of a community thinking tank to solve their issues, form networks, and meet with other farmers. They continued doing this at the Hall, and Valentown became an important part of the National Grange, which had recently been organized and was quickly becoming a central source for coordination and education for farmers across the country. Valentown Hall became the headquarters to the Victor Grange and remained so into the early 1900s. Through the Grange, farmers called for government regulation of railroads and other industries whose prices and practices were monopolistic and unfair. Needing protection from high prices charged by middlemen, the farmers relied on a central organization to achieve their goals.
The farmer is the man, he lives on credit till the fall. With the interest rate so high, it's a wonder he don't die, and the middleman's the one who get it all.
Oliver Hudson Kelly, a former employee of the Agriculture Department, had organized a group called the Patrons of Husbandry in 1868. Membership was open to both men and women, and each local group was known as a Grange. Each Grange chose officers, and the goal of each meeting was to present news of educational value to the farmer. Practices also included music and rituals, which enabled the Grange to be political without being partisan, religious without being denominational, and strongly fraternal, yet highly inclusive of women.
This is the Grange Hall. Harvest time is growing near, starting farmer's rain. Let's load up the old hay truck and drive to town today. All the farmer, put another load away. Hey, hey, farmer's rain, put another load away.
The Granges soon evolved into the National Grange movement. By 1873, the movement was becoming political, and the farmers formed an alliance, promising to support only political candidates who shared their interests, which eventually led to the passage of the Sherman Act, or the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act was the first federal act that outlawed monopolistic business practices. The National Grange is still an important and thriving part of the farming industry, even today. It is the hope of the historic Valentown Museum leaders to keep Valentown Hall also thriving as a living museum dedicated to preserving the history of local agriculture, hometown business, and the entrepreneurial spirit of America. Those entrepreneurial farmers of the land around Valentown Hall were quick to discover that the soil was perfect for growing potatoes.
I've a little tale to tell to you, it isn't very new. I wonder if you know.
Yes, yes, I know.
People eat potato.
Yes, yes, I already know.
People eat potato everywhere you go.
With seed potato companies sprouting up all over, local farmers took advantage of their ideal soil conditions and were responsible for making the area the potato capital of the world.
Yes, yes, I already know. Crop of price potato everywhere you go. With a flower in in his buttonhole, a fella takes a stroll. What blossom does he show?
Yes, yes, I know.
Blossom of potato,
Yes, yes, I already know.
blossom of potato, everywhere you go.
Little children cry for papa, little babies cry for ma. Do you want the kids to grow?
Yes, yes, I know.
Feed a mashed potato.
Yes, yes, I already know. Feed a mashed potato everywhere you
The
go.
local potato business boomed well into the 20th century, until modern transportation and industrial automation moved much of the activity to very large national farming operations. However, the local potato farmer still has a starring role in the Grange display at the historic Valentown Museum. The museum will soon be the center of a Grange revival of sorts, with plans in the works for educational and agricultural gatherings on the site, where local librarians can demonstrate their craft, sell their goods, and continue to exchange ideas that support the values of agriculture and small business.
In the interest of timing, we're not going to make you sit through 10 minutes of comments. Well, did everyone like that? Huh? Let me get set up here. Next, what we're going to do is have the talk that's specific to the National Grange. Is that better? Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lynn Perry, and I am the website manager for the Historic Valentown Museum. And the Grange room became my favorite room when I was a teenage girl, and my girlfriend and I got lost, and we ended up at Valentown, and Sheldon Fisher gave us a tour of the museum. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of a Grange or a Grange room. Over the past 2 years since COVID, I've been independently researching the Grange just because I was curious about them, and I've learned so much. It's just amazing how much information is out there. And I'm pleased to be able to present to you today the high-level bullet points of the Victor Grange and its association with Valentown Hall. There's just so much to tell. It would take me hours and hours, so this is just going to be a very quick walkthrough of what we found and what we know. And we can take your questions after the slide presentation. And so let's move along here. Immediately after the close of the Civil War, the federal government, as you heard in the video, wanted to bring order and healing to the devastation that was brought to the southern states during the Civil War. So in 1866, the Commissioner of Agriculture sent Oliver Hudson Kelley to the southern states that had been ravaged by the war to find out what were their agricultural needs and what kind of assistance that they would need to recover. And it was during this trip that Mr. Kelley conceived of the National Grange. And he pictured it to be an organization or a coalition of farmers. Mr. Kelley was also a Freemason. And so during his travels through the South, he was highly welcomed by the Freemasons down there. And this association with them enabled him to make a good indent into the southern states. Also, because he was a Freemason, he was highly motivated to have the National Grange look a lot like the Freemasons, how they run their organization. On his return from the South, Kelley stopped by in Boston to visit his niece, Caroline Hall, and she declared that he should include women to be a part of his new vision for the National Grange. And Kelley saw the wisdom of this. She also included the idea that they should have equal status and authority as the men. Caroline Hall later was afforded the honor of a founding member, and she was the first woman to be in the organization. On December 4th, in 1867, the National Grange was formally organized, and a trial grange was set up, and it was in the Potomac in Washington, D.C. That grange was set up to figure out all of the ritualisms, the ceremonies, what the membership to the grange would be consisted of, and it was this trial grange that established all of the rest of the National Grange's foundation. The National Grange on the Potomac is in Washington, D.C. It's on 1616 H Street, and it overlooks the White House. The next part of this presentation is going to give you a high-level view of the hierarchical presence of the National Grange at the geographical level. We're going to also talk about the leaderships within the organizations and the specific membership levels. And it's important that you understand how this works at the national level, because it filters down to every single grange underneath, right down to the Victor Grange. Okay, the Grange is an organization that has 5 distinct geographic levels. The first level being the National Grange, which is the tallest of the order, and the one that's located in Washington, D.C. And in the state granges, when 6 subordinate granges can come together to form a state grange, then the state grange is formed. When that happens, all of the subordinate granges within the state become subject to the state grange. Then there are the Pomona granges. Those are the granges that are county granges, or in some cases district granges. And they don't actually have any authority over the subordinate granges within their county. They're there primarily to address issues and to help the local granges coordinate. The subordinate granges are really the guts and the grindstone to the whole National Grange. If you don't have a membership in a subordinate grange, you can't attend or participate in anything within any of the grange levels. Subordinate granges are, they're community-based. They're not geographically held to any specific borders. So you can have granges in different, or memberships from different counties, different towns, actually belong to one grange. And this is why we have the Grange Victor Grange was part of Parrington and part of Ontario County. Typically, all the policies and all of the laws from the resolutions are adopted in the subordinate Grange. After that, if they have a state focus, they'll be brought up to the state Grange, and the state Grange will bring in delegates from all of the other subordinate Granges within the state, and they'll debate on whether or not that law becomes a state law. And if it becomes a state law, then it goes up to the national Grange, and all the delegates are brought in from the state levels to determine whether or not it will now become a national policy. These are the memberships. The founding of the National Grange, rituals and degrees include 7 degrees. And the degrees are based, as you see, on the seasons. And each season has a characteristic of its membership. And each membership has a title for the woman and or the man who's received the degree. The next 3 degrees are held by women, and they're modeled after the goddesses from the Greek and Roman mythology. Ceres is the goddess of grains, upon which subsistence we all depend upon, and the cereals were named after her, Ceres. Pomona is the goddess of fruits, and to whom the fruit growers would appeal for abundant yields and protection of their crops. Flora is the goddess of flowers in spring, and it's because of her that the earth is so beautifully adorned. From the very beginning of the conception of the Grange by Oliver Kelly, the Flora degree was esteemed to be the highest. It was going to be the maximum rank that you could get. This degree interprets all of the ritualisms and all of the ceremonies of the Pomona and the state Granges, and it's made up of some really spectacular ceremonies. The Assembly of Demeter is the controlling body made up of all the 7th degrees. All Grangers who have the 7th degree are automatically a part of the Assembly of Demeter. The Assembly is the custodian of all of the secret and unwritten works. The secret signs, the membership passwords, tests, etc. It's the high priest of the Assembly of Demeter, who's responsible for determining all of the everything about the secret words. And I wish I could give you more detail about that, but it's secret, so I don't have it. In 1868, one of the founders, Francis Marion McConnell, was elected as the first high priest, and he was born in Wayne in Steuben County. He looks kind of stern, doesn't he? But everything I read about him talks about how kind he was, how generous, how caring, how much he gave towards community. So he might just not have wanted his picture taken there. Yeah, I want to spend a few minutes to elaborate now on the expectation of the women in the Grange, because it was so unique that they had any kind of authority or a position like they did in a time when women didn't even have the vote. And the Grange was really big on supporting women's suffrage. At the 1903 National Grange Convention in New York, Susan B. Anthony spoke on equality for women. That same year, Susan B. stated that she could always recognize a Grange woman as far as she could see her, because of her air of feeling herself as good as a man. Suffrage was a big thing with the Grange. Susan B. actually held her last public speaking engagement in 1903 at the National Grange Convention at Washington, D.C. But in fact, women's equality was never quite as simple as all of that, because it was men that set up the roles in the first place. And Founder Kelly believed, and he was convinced, that the women should be restricting their activities to the home or an extension thereof, that work outside in the fields and outdoors would stifle their development of their higher qualities. Reverend Aaron Grosh, another founder, he reflected the male attitude of the day when he stated that, and I quote, A woman will raise the standards with her gentle influence, her innate tact in all matters of good taste and propriety, her instinctive perceptions of righteousness and parity. So in short, the Grange men put their women on pretty high pedestals, and they expected them to stay there. Each Grange at every level has 10 official positions of office, and each position bears a specific title and has a specific emblem to carry when the Grange meetings are in session. And you'll notice here that the master gavel and the overseer gavels, they both have gavels, but the master's gavel is always sizably larger than the overseer's. The 5th, 6th, and 7th degree members, they also have emblems that they have to carry that are symbolic of the produce that they are representing. This is interesting. This was an all-woman officers' Grange, and it's you can see in the photo that they're all holding their emblems of their office. Additionally, when a Grange is in session and a meeting is in session, you also have to have on the master's desk these little replicas of farmers' tools, and each tool represents a characteristic that's expected of the members to be able to work towards and accumulate and acquire. The tools represent pretty much the characteristics of every person in the Grange, regardless of the degree of membership. About that pentagram with the knobs poking up, I don't know what that is. I've looked everywhere. I think it's one of the secret things. The next part of this presentation now is going to show you how the Victor Grange actually came to be. Now that we know what their formation is going to be like, we will go on to see how they actually started. On April 16, 1868, the first dues-paying subordinate Grange was established as the Fredonia Grange No. 1. During that first year, 9 more Granges were established. By the end of the second year, 36 more Granges were established. By the end of the third year, the number almost quadrupled to 180. By the end of the fourth year, the total number of Granges reached 1,005. From 1872 until the end of 1874, the Grange movement was literally exploding, and it was averaging 2,000 Granges a month. By the end of the 8th year, there were 24,290 charters granted Granges. 399 of them were in New York State. By 1899, at the close of that century, there were 883 New York State Granges. By the end of 1973, almost a whole century later, there were 1,503 New York State Granges. Sadly, today there are only 160 left in New York. In 1874 and 1875, Granges in the New York counties of Monroe, Ontario, and Wayne really began to take off. And the Victor Grange was the 30th chartered Grange in that 3-county area, and the 7th to be established in just Ontario County. From the time of the birth of the Victor Grange through to 1912, 18 more subordinate Granges would be established in Ontario County. Today, only the 4 remain: Wide Awake, the Pomona Grange in Clifton Springs, Farmington, and Hopewell. Oops. Their petition was filed and approved on April 7, 1875, and the Victor Grange number 322 was official. As mentioned before, the subordinate Granges were community-based and not with borders. So although the Victor Grange was named after the town of Victor, It included the town of Parrington, and so would include members from both Monroe and Ontario counties. This is the list of the original petitioners. The names highlighted, oops, sorry, I went too fast here. The names highlighted in bright yellow are the officers that were elected, and the women that are highlighted in white were the top 3 degrees, the 5th, 6th, and 7th degrees, Ceres, Pomona, and Flora. I'd like to draw your attention right now to the Pickerings listed. Belle and Jenny Pickering were actually the daughters of Nathan Baker, and they married the Pickering brothers, George and Willis. Jenny Pickering, among other notable accomplishments, she was the first doctor in the area, the first woman doctor in the area. And the descendants of Mary Bell and Willis Pickering are still Grange members, and they've recently been honored by the National Grange for having 5 consecutive generations of Pickering Grange members. Also, Jane Ardell and Mary Bell's father was Nathan Baker. He contributed the timbers that were holding up the first floor of Valentown construction, and a lot of that wood that built that hall came off of Baker Hill. Oh, and Nathan's wife, Mary, she was actually the daughter of the Eldridges. So generally speaking, it was a very tight-knit community. They were very close to all one another. I wish we were more like that today. And here we have, these are the positions that were held by the elected members, and now you can see that they're from all over. We have Egypt, Bushnell's Basin, Victor, Fairport, Fishers. These are the names of the officers. So how did Valentown Hall play a part in all of this? We know that in 1875, the Victor Grange was formally established. We know that Lanson Valentine, also known as Alanson Valentine, was one of its co-founders. We know that Levi and Lanson were responsible for the construction of the hall. We know that construction of the hall was completed 4 years later in 1879, and a year later in 1880, the hall was officially hired by the Grange to house their meetings. And by understanding this timeline and then understanding the Grange, we've come to realize that Valentown Hall, in addition to being built as a general community and commerce center, was also constructed by the Valentown brothers to be Grange compliant. And what do we mean by that? All Grange buildings have in common some very specific architectural considerations that are included in the Grange Hall layout plans in their manuals. So they all have a very familiar and similar look and feel. Valentown Hall shares all of these characteristics as well. First, the Grange meeting room for rituals and ceremonies must have high ceilings and tall windows. At the Valentown Hall, both the ballroom and the Grange room have high ceilings, and the ballroom has very tall windows. The ballroom used to look like this. And this shows one end of the Grange room. The Grange-specific meeting room required very specific floor plans. A prominent stage had to be at one end, and a preparation room and an anteroom at the other end. The anteroom was to contain coat and hat hooks for people to hang their outerwear. The preparation room is where all the items used for the Grange meeting were stored and where the officers would prepare for the rituals and the ceremonies. The top floor of Valentown, simply known as the ballroom, was laid out precisely in this fashion, although what was the preparation room has since been altered. We know this from written testimony of one of the Fisher family members who recalls when that room was remodeled and that there once were coat hooks on the wall of what would have been the anteroom. When a Grange meeting or a ceremony is in session, the room is laid out much like the Masonic Lodge. An altar is located 2/3 of the way from the stage. A cloth or mat is placed 2/3 down from the stage to mark the location for members to stand while addressing the overseer, who sits between the assistant and the lady assistant stewards. On the stage sit the three graces, the Ceres, Pomona, and Flora. No one is permitted to pass between them and the altar except an officer in the line of duty. The master sits at a desk to the left of the stage, and at his desk is the box containing the miniatures of the farmer's working tools that we showed in the little display box. To the right of his desk is the American flag, and the chaplain is seated to his left. The steward is stationed at the door to the anteroom. In the anteroom, the gatekeeper stands guard with his gatekeeper staff. The treasurer and secretary sit at desks to the right of the stage, and the lecturer sits to their right. Seating, usually in the form of permanent benches or pews, are provided for guests and non-Grange meeting participants along the side walls of the room. The Valentown Ballroom also has a raised stage, which was the requirement early on, and also evidence of this type of side seating along the walls. A year after the first Fredonia Grange was established, it was decreed that each Grange would have a museum to display samples of each year's crop and such other items, including local natural curiosities and valuables. Also required is an area dedicated to displaying tools of the agricultural and homesteading. So things like pitchforks, hoes, tillers, spinning wheels, looms, they would be things that would be on display in the museum part of the Grange. Now remember, these were required parts of a Grange building. We still have some looms on display up at the Grange room, and Suzanne over here will show you how to spin them. We know at some point the display of the farm tools was present in the Grange Hall because we have in the archives a photograph of those tools being in that room and on those walls. Granges are really big on education. Grange buildings have to provide a library that is free to the members of the Grange. This is to encourage and promote their education and knowledge for rural farmers and provide a learning experience across all aspects of agriculture and country, people, politics, and much more. We now believe that what up until recently was known as both the office and the ticket room may in fact be the Victor Grange Library Room. It is accessible both by the hall at the top of the stairway and by a door in the Grange room, and to this day is filled with old bookshelves and vintage books and journals. We know from the news article you see on the screen that in 1879, upon completion of the construction of the hall, that $25 was spent to buy a library, and that one of the founders, Charles Woods, donated a bookcase to the library. Next required was an open community meeting room for the general public. Within the community, the hall has a community meeting room. So in closing this part of the subject, we can see that huge areas of Valentown were constructed and completed to actually be Grange compliant. The Victor Grange, founded in 1875, after the 1879 completion of the hall's construction, they operated out of Valentown Hall from April of the following year, 1880, through to the end of 1913. For 33 years, the Victor Grange and Valentown were one and the same. Sadly, it all came to an end on the first Grange meeting in March of 1914. And what would have been the 34th year at Valentown, the Mertensia Grange, number 1160, founded in 1909, was merged with the Victor Grange. And that was the last meeting of the Victor Grange at Valentown Hall. From there, they moved to the Victor Town Hall, And from there, their history continued within the village of Victor until the dissolution. The following week, in an article about the March 7th Grange meeting, it was poignantly observed that this old hall fairly rings with the echoes of Grange meetings and social gathers, and it will be long before the Grange and Valentown Hall cease to be associated in the public mind. Over the years, that association did fade, and except for brief mentions of the Grange while doing tours through the Valentown Hall, the Victor Grange was all but forgotten. So it's with the utmost of pleasure that here today, we're bringing the Victor Grange back into focus and at Valentown Hall. The sources to the information that this presentation shows you are many, but they started with combing through the newspaper articles in the archives at Valentown. From there, I began a thorough self-education on the Grange, and I highly recommend, if you're interested in learning more about them, that you take up these two books, and there's samples of them on the table if you want to pick one up and thumb through it. They are just loaded with interesting information. I just wish I could present it all. After making contact with the Ontario County Pomona Grange Master and the New York State Grange Master, I was armed with enough information to the Victor Grange to pursue further research. And from there, my research just exploded. Sources just seemed to be everywhere. And these are just some of the places where I picked up over a period of almost 2 years, all these sources. The only thing I never found out about was that pentagram. I'm going to find out about that someday. But in the interest of timeliness for this afternoon, I've committed to providing a Zoom meeting for the second half of this presentation, which would be getting to know the actual individuals and the people and their stories who founded the Victor Grange. And there are a lot of really interesting stories. There's tragedies, there's amazing accomplishments, and there's some good humor in there too. So this is the end of this presentation. Don't forget, we open up Sunday after next, June 1st, every Sunday from 1 to 4. Do please come and visit us. And that's all I got. That's it.
Yes, I just want to make one more observation. When we were doing some of this research, we choose 1900 plus or minus because that seems to fit us the best with the things we have in Valentown Hall. So here's one statistic. 1900, over 60% of Americans lived in rural settings. 40% of Americans lived on farms. Today, respectively, it's only 20% of people live in rural areas and 1% are farmers of your entire. So you're looking at a drop from 40% of America at the time down to now 1%. If we forget that, and I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with the works of Wendell Berry. I recommend his poetry or the special on PBS that was about him. You will understand where we are, what we feel about the farming and that story of America that could be easily ignored in terms of not realizing that most of the population did live in the farm country during that time. So thank you for all coming. Yeah.
So Kathryn, that leads us to the Historic Advisory Committee, who is doing interviews. So that leads us to the Historic Advisory Committee, who
has decided over the last couple of years how important the agricultural history is in Victor. We've had, the town has hired the Landmark Society to do an inventory of our barns because over 30% of them are gone over the last 20 years. And we are interviewing farming families that are still here in Victor. So we want to document that. And this really, meshes with the Grange and what their purpose was. And we're finding through our interviews that there aren't very many Victor farmers left because the land is being sold for development.
Correct. And I think when we do tours and we get to the Grange room as our beginning, although we focus a lot more about the Grange mentality as we start a tour, but most people don't even know what the word Grange means. And then so now, this was the most beautiful finding for us because it explains, as Lynn had said, it explains some of the reason, the layout of the building, what it was there for, and one part of the tenet of the Grange was community service. That was a very, very important aspect to the membership, and that was something in that day and age which we've carried along through other organizations. But as I understand it, that the Victor Grange, as it declined, one of the reasons that they disbanded was because they could not fulfill the community service that was expected of each of the Granges working in the community. So it was a very interesting organization and a very much a part of American history. And Valentown.
They couldn't fulfill that because of the age of all the people in the Grange.
Yeah, I would agree. Aged out, people aged out.
Something else to be said is there's an article in the paper in 1974, like a newspaper reprint, that the Grange was big in Fisher's community. 1879, Charles Ford was sent to what I would say was National Grange in New Jersey. He introduced them to the idea that this area had a lot of potato producers. That's where the part of the presentation about potatoes got started, because he went to National Grange, and they promoted him to introduce the idea of growing seed potatoes. And it also was in New Jersey, and New Jersey was lacking for good seed potatoes. So they added to the interest. So the Grange had a big thing about this potato production in the Fishers area. And he went on after this. They have this big potato warehouse in Fishers. It was in part of the presentation. The interesting thing is, sideline to that, eventually my grandfather, Llewellyn Matthews, went to work for him, and he joined the Victor Grange in 1895.
See that all the families are connected, and that is what unified, the building is what unifies all these people. In those days, when you had to get in a buggy just to go anywhere or walk, yeah.
Well, I don't know if she really wants everybody to hear this, but here's Letitia Pickering here, part of the Pickering family that's been in the Grange for years.
Yes, I'm a fifth-generation Granger and was at the National Grange Convention in Niagara Falls last November to receive the
It was
award.
150 years.
Well, New York State Grange was
Yeah,
150 years this last year, but the National Grange is a few more years beyond that.
Right.
Also, my great-great-grandfather was the original master of Victor Grange. And going back to the potatoes, my grandfather, Howard Pickering, raised and shipped seed potatoes all over the country. And when my brother was remodeling the homestead here a year or so ago, they found some of the shipping labels that had Pickering potatoes on it. And he was, according to the genealogy that my uncle did, he was in the process of doing some genetic studies with some of these seed potatoes. But unfortunately, he died in 1920 when my dad, the oldest of 4 children, was only 8 years old. He had probably what they would call today appendicitis and developed sepsis because they didn't have the antibiotics that they have nowadays.
Did you want to ask?
Yeah.
I'm not very good at speaking, but when you're doing these interviews, just beware that you may find that there are just small snapshots of people remembering the Grange. And I come from Spencerport, and my grandmother had told my mother about how that when she was with the Grange, that she was taking a course. I'm not sure what the course was, but among the members of in this course was the wife of the governor at the time, who became president, Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member, and she was quite proud of being in a class with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah, it's important to realize that the idea, and I don't know when it happened, I suppose we have to blame the Clampetts for part of the idea of the farming community, that they were as sharp as they could be, and they were the big businessmen of the time, because that was the biggest business going, other than industrial, when we started doing, making shoes in factories, knitting factories, and all of that. But the other big players, as that sign we have back there, I feed you all. I mean, that's what they did. And they were sharp as they could be, as they were very good businessmen. And that came right from the roots up, so.
So I have 2 things. First of all, does the Grange exist as people actually have meetings and have the hierarchies and do the nitty-gritty? I mean, I know I live near Bristol, and I know the Grange has activities there, but are they like really a functioning club? And my second comment is, have you all ever thought about doing a presentation to the Victor Rotary? I think it would be a great way for y'all to get exposure and membership and sort of enliven it, and the Rotary folks are wonderful, so it's something to think about.
Well, thank you. And the Granges are still in existence today. You can, as Linda pointed out, there are some that are in key positions in the area, and the State Grange, we're working with them. I am also working with the curator of the New York State Grange. She was very busy, yeah, Bailey, yeah. They were busy with their 150th anniversary, so I just wrote her again last week, so we can get online and get some information from there. Now, one of the things we are looking for, according to the state of New York, is when the Grange disbanded, they had to hand in everything, all the minutes of their meeting, all of their history, all their ephemera, their paperworks. And there was a lot of things that weren't there for the Victor Grange when it was retired, because the state of New York Grange keeps all of those things on file. So if anybody knows about any in a nook and cranny, I mean, we're afraid some of it just got tossed out and somebody didn't recognize it for what it was. But if there's anybody that knows or comes across something that might relate to the Victor Grange, we'd be more than happy to see it. And the New York State Grange is also interested in finding some of that history, so. So it should go to the State Grange first technically, and then we would ask them for the copies that we needed. So that's how that works, courtesy-wise. So, anybody else have any?
It'd be interesting know the membership of the organization itself too, because there's people who may, I mean, if you're looking for books relating to farming and things like that, that may be of members and things like that, there's other non-official Grange attributed material that could be tied in with Grange because the person is a member.
Yes.
That might be at least knowing this person. Like there's a John Jacob Thomas who is a prominent. He wrote monthly books on everything on the sun for nurseries and things like that. Lived up the Plank Road in Macedon, and he was a very prominent monthly. Wrote a monthly magazine. It's kind of like a thick book.
A gazette, sometimes they call
A
them,
gazette,
yeah.
And to be I know of him because of my research on the Farmington 1816 Meeting House Museum, that he's a prominent abolitionist and involved. His father was person who was engineer for the Erie Canal, But I've got material on John Jacob Thomas.
I think unless you talk, as Lynn said, we have a lot more information of the people and the members of the Grange. They're the story, really.
Yeah.
I mean, the Grange, we can go through the degrees in the organization,
Yeah.
but to make it a reality is how, when you put names to all of these
Right.
things that people did.
But,
So the people are more, actually the most important aspect.
And to let you know, I do research for the 18th historical research, and one of the things that I have done is my main file is like 4,000 people on my that pinpoint people centralized in this area, but Quakers, but it's just not Quakers, it's Western New York, so.
If we wouldn't have information like that, but there's always somebody else. That's why we share with other organizations, we share with each other. So we can, yes, if we weren't to acquire something like that, but we knew who does,
Right.
and when we need it, we go to them and we promote each other, actually.
Well,
Yeah, that's a.
The most important thing you have to do if you're young, somebody's older than you are, you better ask questions today.
Yes.
It's too late later.
I think I can attest to that myself with Ancestry, because I found things out about my family that nobody knew. I don't think anybody would talk about now. But it's very interesting that my sibling and I are probably the only ones that know the most about my family, and they never talked about it themselves. So, yeah, it's important.
Well, George, as a youth growing up next door to you at Valentown Hall, I did meet some of those early Grange members. Herman Gipp, who was lived at the top of the hill, who was the last grocer there till 1910. And I'm thinking particularly of Benson Baker, who lived atop Baker Hill. And I talked with him in the Grange room and asked him about the layout, and he said that's where the meetings were held. And I said, was there ever a library there? And he said, yes, the bookcase was right over there. And he pointed to the section of the wall adjoining the door into the ticket office. So that would clarify, I think, one of the questions you had about where the meetings were held. The ballroom may have been set up according to the plan in the original national publications, but the actual meetings were in that Grange room.
No, they had, we understood. A lot of Granges, like the House of Guitars, which I don't know if people know, those were halls too, and they did as much of their activities as they could. However, some weren't as extensive as ours. It's a smaller building, and you can see that it was pared down. They did it, but Valentown Hall was a big dream for Grange. It was like a big presentation, a big idea. Everything that the Grange did, that they put it in under one roof. And we may be one of the most unusual Grange, and still intact and not repurposed into a music store. And we, by the way, we do want to go visit them because we understand that the top floor of the Grange, the House of Guitars, sags because there were too many records and things. But we want to go upstairs to see what's left. What is any clues there about what they did? But they used, some of the Granges went into the community, which is what they were supposed to do, to have other activities. But with Valentown, it was all on one stop. And they brought their vendors in too. So very, very unusual.
And the date of 1914, which is when it was pointed out that the Grange left there, that was right after George and Jane Pickering had died, and they sold the property to Bertha Burgett the year prior. So there was also a question about what happened to all the furnishings when they came to the Victor Town Hall. Esther Green, who was the last head of the Victor Grange, she told me that the records pre-1933 were destroyed in the fire when the Victor Town Hall burned. And separately I've heard, well, some of the furniture survived, but I don't know what happened to that. I don't know whether the bookcase that was bought initially got survived. It'd be interesting if any of that might still be around the community somewhere. But it is correct, as was pointed out, that when a Grange disbands, the material is supposed to go to the the state Grange in Cortland. Paperwork then placed on deposit in the library at Cornell, the Owen Library. But when the Farmington Grange dissolved a few years ago, they announced that they were turning all of their material over to the State Grange. And I said, well, all the time on eBay I see Grange artifacts. Not everybody does that, but they were going to. And I know that's also what happened to the Egypt Grange, right at the end of Victor Egypt Road. What was called the Fairport Grange then? Fairport. But it was based in Egypt, and that building's now a lawyer office.
That's the Grange I belong to.
Oh, okay.
We just don't have a hall.
Yeah, okay. But is that Grange still in existence then? Oh, good.
Not very active.
Because I remember seeing the charter at that building just before they closed, and I thought that they said that they were turning that charter over to the state. I guess not. No. Oh, good.
The previous Grange for them was in the Brown Building in Fairport. Is it next to the canal that's now the library? They had a Grange in there for...
There was a Bound building, but I don't think the Grange. There was a building between the railroad tracks that they met in, my mother used to say, because she didn't remember it so much as her parents talked about it, because they'd have to stop the meetings when the trains went through because they couldn't hear.
Yeah, I know. I'm involved with a building very close, and nobody can talk when they're going through. So
that wouldn't happen with canal boats.
No.
Well, thank you all. Hope you've gotten a new aspect for people that have known the building all along, or maybe you haven't been introduced to the building before. But we're pretty proud of this aspect of the building. And as I said, if anybody wants to watch that special on Wendell Berry that was on WXXI, it was exceptional. I think that was my come to Jesus moment when I saw how wonderfully that was produced. And we're very proud of our farmhouse. It never became a big fancy estate farm, because this is the real people. The little house that's there, never got it beyond that. And that is the real story. That's all the real people that are involved in this venture. So Enjoy your rest of your afternoon, and thank you for coming.
Kathryn, thank you very much for coming. Lynn, thank you for all of your research on this. This was great. And there's a demonstration of spinning in the back and some artifacts and pictures and things. So help yourself to go back, or if you have any other questions, talk with any of the presenters. Thank you very much.